Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third panel of our conference on migration, which deals with the social implications of migration. My name is Nicholas Kalenda, and I'm a first-year master's student in the MERS Minas program here at our esteemed university. We have a wonderful lineup of 4 scholars for you this afternoon who will cover topics spanning from 19th century Koreans in a land between 3 empires to our current need for more comprehensive information on the health and health needs of migrants in Africa, with each piece of research using different research methodologies which are sure to interest both social scientists and scholars in the humanities alike. To begin, we have Alyssa Park, an associate professor at the University of Iowa, providing us with a history of Korean migrants in Tidzinhe in the 19th and 20th century, and how the Qing, Joseon, and Russian empires attempted to establish a form of sovereignty over these claimed subjects. Professor Park received her PhD from Columbia University, has been the recipient of many prestigious grants and fellowships, and has authored Sovereignty Experiments, Korean Migrants, and the Building of Borders in Northeast Asia, 1860 to 1945, which was released last year by Cornell University Press. Next, we have the Korean Foundation Endowed Associate Professor Jae-un Kim from our university, who will provide us with an interesting study of following Chinese Korean Christian migrants, especially those who came to America, which challenges generally held notions of migration and the contradictory and difficult road that the state imposes on migrants. Professor Kim received her PhD from UCLA and has also been a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton and Stanford. Professor Kim received her PhD from UCLA and, sorry about that, just reread a line. Coming third, we have Dr. Francis Bombali from Makerere University School of Public Health in Uganda, and he is providing a presentation on the need for more extensive and comprehensive information regarding the health and health needs of migrants in Africa. Dr. Bombali is a regional migration health specialist for United Nations, or the IOM, or International Organization for Migration. Finally, we have Volha Chikina providing us with a study on the occupational expectations of migrants and its relationships with migrant integration policies in European countries. Dr. Chikina received her PhD from Pennsylvania State University and is now a postdoctoral fellow here at the Donia Human Rights Center. I'll be assisting these wonderful scholars in keeping time and have the pleasure of posing them a couple of questions and facilitating a Q&A between them and you, the audience. Without further ado, I cede the podium to Professor Park.
Just testing the equipment here. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in an illuminating conference. And thank you especially to Dr. Jae-un Kim for the personal invitation and also the NOM Center for sponsoring my visit. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So as our discussant mentioned, I have just published a book, Sovereignty Experiments, Korean Migrants and the Building of Borders in Northeast Asia. So this talk is a very compressed kind of summary of the highlights from this book. And so I was trying to do a couple of things with the book, which was looking at a space. We often, when migrants leave, we don't hear from the countries they left from, but because Koreans actually migrated in a place where there were contiguous borders, these 3 countries, and because they were the most populous ethnic group in this region, we often have the privilege as a historian to actually look back and see how these different governments were actually communicating with each other about these migrants who maintain these transnational ties across this space. Another thing the book tries to do is actually look at how are governments, how are states that we often think of as illiberal states actually participating in a project of governing migrants, which we often think of as part of this Anglophone world, right, with these exclusion policies. But we see something both similar and different in this space. And another thing, my project as a historian, primarily of East Asia, but using Russian sources, is really to help us reimagine this place. Does Russia belong in East Asia? Does East Asia belong in Russia? So I would like to kind of help us to bring these spaces together, if you will. So I would like to orient us first in space. I'll provide a lot of maps and close-ups. So here is the region that I call Northeast Asia. And the book specifically focuses on this tripartite border region. I'm often going to refer to China as Qing China, the dynastic name, Korea as Joseon Korea, which is the dynastic name for Korea, and Russia as the Tsarist Empire or the Russian Empire. And the space that I look at, primarily for the book, it's something that I call the Tumen Valley for the Tumen River, which actually kind of goes through present-day North Korea, China, and Russia. And so the more specific geographic designations you can see there. And I'll start with a story, as historians often do. In 1867, the Jilin garrison commander spotted 200 Koreans traveling eastward. They were riding ox-driven wagons and appeared to be traveling with their families. The commander raced after them and asked them where they were going. One of the Koreans, speaking in Chinese, said, "Russia has called several thousand of our people and is developing land in Tijinha." I have a close-up here. "There have been bad years of harvest at home, and we have no strength to pay taxes in Joseon. Life is hard, so we had no other path but to throw away our past lives, flee, and eke out a living elsewhere." The Jilin commander soon ordered an investigation of the matter, and he was shocked at what he discovered. Thousands of Koreans had made a permanent home for themselves in Tijinha and other places in the southern maritime province, a territory that Russia had annexed only a few years earlier. According to the report, Koreans were walking around in Russian, Chinese, and Korean clothing. There was a disarray in clothes and hats. A local Qing official tried to persuade the Koreans to return to Joseon, but a Russian border guard stopped him. The Russian was firm in his response. He said that the Koreans were, quote-unquote, under the jurisdiction of Russia. The Jilin commander reported the news to his boss in Shengjing, the capital in Manchuria, which then urged the Joseon king to rectify the situation on the border. In the years that followed, this kind of incident repeats. Koreans were found outside Korea, in Russia, and various combinations of these three governments get involved, and there was a consistency in the type of reactions. There was a respective claiming of Koreans, claiming them as Russian subjects, as Joseon subjects, and after the 1880s as Qing, or Chinese subjects. But what exactly is the issue at stake? Why did officials react this way by attempting to claim them? Another way to state these questions, perhaps in language that we're more familiar with, is, do states have a right to make claims on newly arrived people? Do they have a right to state claims on people who leave their country? Who has the right to control movement itself? Was there a norm at this time by which officials are supposed to act? So around the world in the 19th century, the opening up and settlement of frontier areas, as well as the people pouring into these areas, pushed states to consider, how do you govern movement? This is no different in this tripartite border area. The migration of Koreans from the 1860s becomes an occasion for officials to come together and contemplate matters of jurisdiction, borders, and also the assertions of sovereign states. So officials are sorting out this newness of mobility and the newness of what we now consider international law. And for Korea, it had to deal with interacting with a country with which it had no formal relations until 1884, and this is Russia. So this paper moves through first the history of the migration of Koreans to this area, early China-Russia interactions over Koreans, and then Korea-Russia interactions. I hope I get to it all. So the history of this place. So the maritime province today is part of Russia. But before it was annexed in 1860, it was a border region between China and Korea, so Qing China and Joseon Korea. And it was specifically marked off as part of the prohibited zone. The prohibited policy was enacted by Manchu rulers shortly after the establishment of the Qing dynasty in the 17th century. And this was a ban on permanent settlement in the region. You were not allowed to live there if you already weren't living there. So the ban was supposed to protect the purity of the Manchu homeland. And along with this ban on permanent settlement for foreigners or outsiders, there was also a prohibition on private commercial activity in the zone. So the purpose being to preserve the region's abundance of natural resources, timber, wild ginseng, sable, pearls. These were items that were marked off as tribute items, and they were supposed to be offered only to the Qing emperor. So apart from preserving the integrity of Manchuria and its natural resources, this prohibited policy set forth kind of overarching vision of stability for the Qing imperial realm by discouraging movement and keeping foreigners out. And only military officials and indigenous peoples who were native to the region were allowed to dwell there. Joseon upheld a similar policy of prohibition. In the early years of the dynasty, security concerns on its northern borderlands were paramount. And so the court tried to minimize its own people's interactions with what they considered dangerous outside elements, such as the Jurchen barbarians. Private commercial activity was banned in the 6 forts area. You can see these marked off. I think they're the squares. Excuse me. So private commercial activity is banned in the 6 forts area, which was the northernmost part of Hamgyong province, bordering on the Tumen River. In the late 17th century, after a particularly egregious act of border crossing, the Joseon government enacted on crossing the border, a prohibition on crossing the border to collect and trade ginseng. Anyone who crossed the border to engage in such acts was deemed a criminal and would be punished severely by decapitation. The area in the north remained largely uninhabited, though not because of the ban, but because of its relatively remote location. In spite of the border prohibitions by these 2 states, people, of course, kept crossing back and forth. We know this very well from our own land borders in the US. It was effectively impossible to guard the vast area with a limited number of military officials. When trans-border violence or illegal activity broke out, Qing and Joseon officials jointly administered an investigation of all parties involved. And what did they do with the border crossers? Their policy was repatriation. The people would be repatriated back to their original country when possible, so that they could be punished accordingly by their own government. So border transgressions persist as a point of contention between the 2 states. But given that the area was still largely uninhabited, there was a relatively small number of infractions. And this small number made it possible to actually resolve these infractions according to existing protocols. So that's by repatriation and/or punishment. And most of these instances were simply ignored or undetected. But the mid-19th century brings change. There are significant changes in the region that make border crossing more noticeable, to the point where it becomes a so-called problem. So there were signs that more and more Koreans from northern Hamgyong province were crossing the Tumen River and entering the prohibited zone on Qing territory and then Russia. The character of migration also shifts dramatically. Large numbers of families and seasonal farmers were settling outside of Korea. Environmental factors had much to do with the transformation. Historians have noted that the 19th century in Korea was largely a so-called wet century. So there were recurrent floods that devastated the irrigation networks and paddy land and eroded the land. In the south, if you were affected by these agricultural changes and floods, you would move to a neighboring town for work, maybe a neighboring province. In the north, if you wanted to move or had to move, you actually had a different option. You had the option of leaving the country completely by crossing the border to China and after 1860 to Russia. That year, Russia and Qing signed the Supplementary Treaty of Beijing. So under the terms of the treaty, the Qing ceded the Ussuri region to Russia, an act which completed the longest land border in the world at the time. Russia also gained a border with Korea. The presence of this new power in the region shines a kind of spotlight on the migration that was already underway. Russia's presence also creates new reasons to move. It begins state-led projects to develop the land, very similar to projects that you have in the Pacific Northwest and California, railroads, new cities, land reclamation, mining, frontier development all around the globe in the 19th century. And so these projects are drawing seasonal workers from around the region. The region, newly acquired by Russia, not many Russians there, so they make do with the people who are closest, and these would be Chinese and Koreans. So the Chinese are primarily traveling from Shandong province in northern China, and then eventually, after the building of railroads from the northern parts of Manchuria, which are Heilongjiang and Jilin, and Vladivostok becomes a hub for these people. So this is the famous wharf in Vladivostok, where most of the Koreans and Chinese had their markets, bazaars. So Koreans had the easiest access to the maritime province. And similar to the migration to the maritime province, you have parallel movement to the Chinese side. By the turn of the century, there were about 20,000 Koreans in the southern half of the maritime province called Ussuri. By 1917, 50,000. By 1929, 150,000. These numbers may not seem very large, but 150,000 was actually a quarter of the population of the maritime province. And in the immediate border region called Pasyet, another. So here's the famous market where the Koreans and Chinese had their shops, and you can see kind of this multi-ethnic, multinational dimension of the people there. In the immediate border region, they form 90% of the population, and these kind of statistics continue into the 1930s when you have a tragic incident, which I will get to. It's a cliffhanger for you all until the end. In addition to this settlement, you actually have 25 to 30,000 Koreans moving in and out of the Russian Far East for seasonal work. It seems I've used up most of my time on this introduction, but let me just tell you a bit about some of the disputes that were emerging between these three governments, and this had much to do with jurisdiction. So the area always had a land border, but the borders are obviously redrawn. But these are not the state borders that you have, which is part of the post-1945 international order, right, where a border is very clearly demarcated and states have very clear claims to territory and people. These ideas of sovereignty and jurisdiction are very much in flux in the 19th century. And so you have a lot of disputes where you have this place which is sparsely populated, and then all of a sudden, in a matter of a decade or two, becomes more and more populated with Koreans. Especially since you had an active policy between the Joseon and Qing governments that explicitly prohibited settlement and migration into this region. So you can imagine the surprise of the Joseon and the Qing governments as they're trying to deal with more and more of these Koreans moving into this prohibited area. In 1869, you actually have a flood of more than 6,000 Koreans across the Tumen River, again, because of severe flooding. The Russian government surprises both the Qing and the Joseon states and officials. The Qing and Joseon are sending officials to investigate these Koreans who are actually deemed criminals, right? According to the border prohibition, the Russian government's policy is simply to say that they were under the jurisdiction of Russia. And indeed, the Russian government starts very early on to claim the Koreans as Russian subjects. Within Russian bureaucratic circles, although they actually kind of portray a very confident stance towards China and Korea, simply because they don't want these outside governments to interfere in what they consider a domestic matter, there was a lot of uncertainty among Tsarist officials about how actually to handle this mobile population in regard to international law, in quotes. And why was this? It was because historically, Russia and China, unlike the European maritime empires, had actually had treaties going back to the 17th century where they had a policy of plural jurisdiction in their shared borderland. So unlike the extraterritoriality regimes that emerged in the 19th century, from the 17th century, they had this policy of mutual extradition in which both Qing and Russian criminals who ran across the border would actually be jointly investigated and then again repatriated, returned to his original country so that he could be tried and punished there. So this border region had historically been a place where overlapping jurisdictions had been the norm. In the 19th century, you have new international treaties enter the picture. So Russia and China signed new treaties in the 1860s after the Opium War. And there was actually a confusing provision that declares that Qing subjects, so China had actually cedes this part of the maritime province to Russia. And there's a curious provision that Qing subjects who are already living in the lands ceded to Russia at the time of the signing of the treaty would actually be left there and remain under the jurisdiction of the Qing. So you have a border region that's now a part of Russia, but it is still guided by this principle of murky jurisdiction. The Qing is exercising authority over its subjects legally according to this international treaty in what is now Russian territory. So Russian officials are trying to now limit Asian migration. There's a tension, right? You need migrant workers to work in these industries where you have no workers. So they're hiring Korean and Chinese contract laborers, and yet they are making concerted efforts to limit this Asian migration. Strained relations between China and Russia actually steer Russia to take a clear defensive posture regarding the Koreans on its territories. So rather than negotiate with China or Korea, Russia actually declares legal authority over the Koreans by granting them subjecthood, which is today's citizenship, right? As early as 1865. So Russia has now declared that naturalization to a new country is permitted without legally expatriating from your former country. Perhaps we can talk more in Q&A about the significance of this shift in the perspective of the Tsarist regime towards what subjecthood is. How many minutes do I have? -1. Okay. Okay. The claiming of migrants, so you have the Russian government claiming Joseon subjects. You also have the Joseon government who actively takes measures to claim its subjects in Russia. It actually sends officials to take a census of its people abroad and to register them in their local household registers. After Russia and Korea finally established diplomatic relations in 1884, the Joseon government still does not relinquish its authority over Koreans abroad. And finally, the Russian government acts unilaterally in 1891. Just a few closing thoughts. So I argue that these acts of claiming migrants are actually an act of the sovereign state, claiming its territory and people. So in regard to Korean migrants, they remained an arena where Korean officials, Russian officials, later Chinese and Japanese officials act out sovereignty on the Korean migrants through the first half of the 20th century. The mobility of migrants was viewed as a problem and a question because they touched off the anxieties of these four states at a time when they were subjected to intrusion by outside powers. So migrants, by crossing the borders, seemed to push the authority of one state across the border into the domain of another. And so states actually have to act defensively by claiming these migrants as their own to ward off the interference from outside states. In the mid-1930s, amidst heightened domestic and international security concerns in the region, especially suspicions of Japan's imperialist aims, the Soviet state went to extreme measures to protect its sovereignty in the East. In 1937, it forcefully deported the entire Korean population from the maritime province, almost 200,000 then, and moved them thousands of miles away in Central Asia. By removing the Koreans from the border area, the Soviet Union momentarily displaced its anxieties about a sensitive border area. In place of Koreans, Stalin moved Slavic soldiers, who were assumed to be a loyal force, to occupy the homes, the gardens, the spaces that Koreans had once occupied. And I think this area never recovered from the removal of the 200,000 Koreans. It remained an off-limits zone. Even today, you need permission from the local government to actually enter this zone. Thank you.
Try and keep this as quickly as possible. Next, we have Professor Jaeun Kim. Her lecture is titled Redemption, Asylum-Seeking on Religious Grounds in the Era of Involuntary Immobility. So.
Okay, all right, great. So thanks a lot. I'd like to thank the International Institute and also Neil for putting all of this together, and also our discussant, Nicholas, who seems to be the heavy lifting, like reading 4 papers rather than 3 papers and giving us comment. And also thank you everybody for showing up, like sleepy afternoon. My presentation today is from my new book project, with the same preliminary title, Redemption, Asylum-Seeking on Religious Grounds in the Era of Involuntary Mobility. And it is based on my multi-sided ethnographic research in Korea, China, and the United States that spans about 10 years. But today, I'm going to focus on presenting some piece of the theoretical framework that I am constructing, rather than getting too much into the ethnographic materials that I have been collecting. I would say my presentation is actually going to align pretty nicely with some of the earlier presentation that sort of try to capture this precarious and sometimes really rigid boundary between citizenship and non-citizenship. So you may remember at the beginning of 2017, the Trump administration made Christian refugees an exception to its so-called Muslim ban. Back then, pundits wondered if this policy would require the government to establish the religious identity of refugees, whether or not they are actually Christians, although the constitutionality of such a practice was questionable. This kind of a quandary is not new. For example, there have been reports on the controversies over the authenticity of the Christian conversion of Muslim migrants from Iran, Afghanistan, or Syria. Apostasy is treated as a crime in their origin countries, so the Christian conversion of these Muslim migrants is often suspected as an opportunistic move to acquire a relief from deportation. Similarly, the New York Times reported in 2014, posted up there, on the arrest of more than 30 people charged with helping Chinese immigrants submit false asylum claims, including the claims based on quote-unquote fake Christian identity. The anxiety and ambivalence toward religious conversion, presumably for asylum-seeking purposes, are palpable in these accounts. The subtitle of this New York Times article here, An Industry of Lies, is telling. It highlights the instrumentality and the presumptive immorality of the phenomenon. But I came to find this prevalent account problematic as I explored the migration careers, legalization strategies, and conversion patterns of ethnic Korean migrants from China to the United States. So let me just introduce population a little bit. Korean Chinese are the descendants of colonial-era migrants from the Korean Peninsula and an ethnic minority in China. They remained concentrated in their ethnic enclave in Northeast China, which Professor Alyssa Park just sort of covered for us throughout the Cold War era. But since the early 1990s, labor migration has become a major strategy with which they have weathered the drastic economic transformation of China. A decade of diverse and intensive migration to neighboring regions prepared the way for the frequently unauthorized migration to destinations outside Northeast Asia. In the United States, Korean Chinese mostly work in Korean or Chinese ethnic enclaves, and some of them have sought to legalize their immigration status by seeking asylum, including submitting asylum claims based on a persecuted Christian identity. This case makes me ask several interesting questions. What local, national, and transnational institutions, networks, and moral economies make asylum seeking, especially asylum claims based on a persecuted Christian identity, a conceivable and actionable legalization strategy? What kinds of practical challenges, legal intricacies, and moral dilemmas do various actors face, and how do they make sense of and respond to these? And how do the complex interactions among these actors over time reshape migrant incorporation into the local community, the national body politics, and a transnational community of faith? To answer these questions, I'd like to develop a relational, processual, and agentic theoretical framework. And as part of that effort, I situate the asylum institution in the regime of what some scholars call probationary citizenship. I think in the early morning session, we sort of covered all these different concepts that try to sort of capture this differential inclusion of non-citizens, and I think this concept of probationary citizenship is also part of that effort. So in contemporary immigration states, unauthorized migrants are often treated as civic culprits to be punished, and simultaneously as civic minors to be redeemed, depending on their deservingness, as if they are on probation. I mean, if you think about how we talk about dreamers, for instance, you can sort of have some ideas of what this concept tries to capture. Building on this insight, I approach Asylee-Making as a tension-reading co-production of various state and non-state actors. They mobilize multiple and often mutually contradictory understandings of who are redeemable civic minors and how one can achieve this status. These understandings may congeal into an assemblage of institutions, discourses, and practices. And these institutions and discourses and practices constitute what I would like to call a redemption project. A redemption project provides plausible and legitimate vocabularies of motives, in sociologist C. Wright Mills' term, distinctive parameters of worth, and a quintessential moral career, borrowing the term from Irving Goffman of a redeemable migrant. The asylum institution, if you think about it, represents one such redemption project. The state, with its unique power of consecration, defines a certain group of illegal immigrants as redeemable and transforms them into a privileged group of refugees. But this alchemy of the state is neither internally coherent nor externally uncontested. Drawing on my empirical findings, I identify 3 redemption projects that shape the contested and fractured terrain that Korean Chinese unauthorized migrants in the US must navigate. These projects are informed respectively by the logic of humanitarian benevolence, the logic of the market, and the logic of divine grace. And each of these projects tends to be embraced and enacted by the asylum institution, commercialized migration brokerage, and religious organizations. So in the bigger book project this paper is part of, I show how the dynamic interplay of these multiple redemption projects shape the migration careers, legalization strategies, and also convergent patterns of Korean Chinese asylum seekers. For today's presentation, due to time constraints, I'd like to limit myself to presenting the disparate logics of these 3 projects, constructed inductively from my ongoing multi-sided ethnographic research in Los Angeles, New York City, Seoul, and the Yanbian Korean Autonomous Prefecture in Northeast China, which spanned about 10 years. So let me just start with the first redemption project enacted by the asylum institution. In most contemporary liberal democracies, establishing particular kinds of victimhood exonerate unauthorized migrants from their prior violation of immigration laws and renders them deserving of state protection and membership. To demand such a humanitarian benevolence, asylum seekers must establish that their departure from the origin country and unlawful presence in the host country were motivated only by their well-founded fear of persecution on the ground stipulated in relevant refugee laws. This seemingly noble and innocuous repertoire of humanitarianism contributes to the distinctive predicament in which asylum seekers find themselves. In the era of migration asylum nexus, cremigration, and the securitization of migration, asylum seekers are constantly subject to a presumptive skepticism that they are, in fact, not helpless and harmless victims driven out by persecution, but capable, voluntary economic migrants faking victimhood for immigration purposes. But this binary distinction and the accompanying moral panic over migrants category jumping, that is, from the category of economic migrants to the category of refugees, obscures one crucial fact. It is that the asylum institution itself, embedded in the broader politics of immigration deterrence, systematically favors not the more vulnerable, but the more resourceful. Because of the vigorous gatekeeping practices of affluent liberal democracies, only those equipped with requisite economic, social, and cultural capital can secure access to the territories of these states. Many scholars have also shown that the refugee status determination process that follows once they secure entry similarly favors the better resource. In addition to these internal tensions within the asylum institution, I'd like to show how the state's redemption project is contested by the 2 alternative projects. The first is the redemption project informed by the logic of the market. And it is enacted by commercialized migration brokerage that helps unauthorized migrants redeem themselves from illegality so long as they are willing and able to pay. This redemption project associates purchasing power with moral worth, appreciates entrepreneurial virtues, and promotes commensurability across what political philosopher Michael Walzer calls different spheres of justice. So it's just very different logic from the humanitarian institution. Seen from this perspective, the asylum system is not so much a distinctive humanitarian regime. It is rather one of the few interchangeable and purchasable or investable avenues of legalization, not qualitatively different from other means of obtaining legal status. Similarly, the Asylee status is considered not a reward for the extreme hardship and loss migrants have suffered. It is rather an award winnable only by those possessing a range of virtues, including ambition and guts, good credit, diligence, tenacity, and trustable demeanor. I argue that such an entrepreneurial attitude does not constitute the radical opposite to the noble asylum institution. Rather, paradoxically, this attitude is in part a product of migrants' extensive engagement with the asylum institution, which often requires and rewards capability and performance rather than vulnerability and victimhood. To speak more precisely, their engagement with the asylum institution in action vindicates the virtue of entrepreneurial dispositions which have been nurtured by their struggle to overcome involuntary immobility imposed by global mobility regimes. In this context, refusing to engage in a complex legal, semi-legal, and illegal means to overcome involuntary immobility is taken as a shameful sign of incompetence rather than an expression of admirable moral rectitude. My ethnographic findings also reveal that some migrants exhibit a more subversive interpretation of their commodified category jumping, that is, from the category of migrants to the category of refugees. They see expensive brokerage fees, which are essential for both for migration and asylum seeking, is a reflection of the state's categorical discrimination against the underprivileged members of an increasingly yet differentially globalizing world. The extensive migration experience of the Korean Chinese has highlighted, rather than naturalized, the fundamental arbitrariness of what legal scholar Ayala Shaha called the birthright lottery of citizenship, and more generally, the arbitrariness of the state's power to determine who deserves entry on what terms and at what cost. This is in part because Korean Chinese migrants get to compare their situation with the privilege enjoyed by other ethnic Koreans with better passports. For example, as of January 2017, the number of countries that South Korean passport holders can access visa-free is about 3 times greater than the Chinese counterparts, including many European countries and the United States. Korean Chinese migrants lack this collective credit that the holders of a highly ranked passport enjoy, regardless of their individual qualifications. So they often have to rely on expensive human smuggling schemes that cost about $50,000 in the middle of the 2000s on private credit simply to secure entry. Interestingly, the asylum institution turns this categorical disadvantage into an exceptional opportunity to legalize their unauthorized status. That is, their bad passport can open a path toward legal residency and citizenship in the United States once they manage to secure entry by whatever means available. This is an option categorically foreclosed for South Korean passport holders. But nationality alone is insufficient for Chinese migrants to acquire the asylee status. They need to establish that they belong to one or more of the following categories: political dissident, a victim of the coercive one-child policy, or a member of an illegal religious organization such as Falun Gong or a house church. I don't have time to explain why in detail, but for several reasons, many Korean Chinese migrants come to consider the persecuted Christian identity preferable to other victim personas. So they turn to Korean American Protestant congregations for assistance. And this brings us to the final redemption project that I examined. The literature on immigration and religion has documented how a particular theology and a general commitment to social justice motivate religious actors to get involved in migrants' legalization efforts, often in defiance of the state. The sanctuary movement is a good example of that. My study sheds new light on the critical role of religious actors, not in the realm of social movement or advocacy, but in bureaucratic and judicial settings through what legal scholars call the credible membership test. What is a credible membership test? The religious asylum applicant must submit certificates from an authorized cleric that document her membership in the faith community at issue and her acceptance of baptism or other equivalent status confirmation rituals. In some cases, the cleric may go so far as writing a letter or giving a personal testimony in court that endorses the depths of a particular applicant's faith. Further, asylum officers and judges examine whether the applicant can demonstrate basic knowledge, a pattern of practices, and embodied demeanors normally expected of the members of the faith community to which she claims to belong. So this is a test whether or not this person can credibly claim membership in a faith community. This particular verification regime shapes the distinctive relationship that religious organizations come to have with the two redemption projects I discussed previously. And two ideal type responses are conceivable. One, under certain circumstances, religious actors also interested in distinguishing the genuinely faithful from imposters may choose to function as private deputies for the gatekeeping state rather than as advocates for unauthorized migrants. However, under other circumstances, religious actors may lend themselves to migrants' spontaneous redemption project while suspending the question of the sincerity of their alleged faith. The Korean Immigrant Evangelical Church falls closely to the latter pole and has become an ambivalent and reluctant aid to the asylum seeking of co-ethnic migrants. The logic of divine grace informs this redemption project. In this project, religious actors focus on making the faithful rather than on screening them, on creating their redeemability rather than on adjudicating it. Less than genuine asylum seeking is recognized as part of the acceptable vocabularies of motive behind the pursuit of a membership in a given faith community, so long as this motive sets asylum seekers on a redemptive moral career, which eventually leads to their belated yet serious commitment to Christianity. This logic of thinking can be applied to other religious institutions. But in my case, several characteristics of evangelicalism in general and Korean American evangelicalism in particular deeply inform the redemption project under examination. So let me just point out a few of these characteristics. So on the one hand, the Christian identity is understood to transcend worldly boundaries that criminalize church members' presence in the US. On the other hand, the same Christian identity is seen to give church members privileged access to the US and Americanness. America is hailed as a land of material prosperity and spiritual revival founded on and thriving because of the Puritan principle. As long as these hardworking, outwardly mobile Korean Chinese asylum seekers really convert, they are entitled to build their lives in the US. These two accounts underscore the trans-ethnic Christian identity. But another justificatory account relies on the distinctive ethno-religious narrative. According to this narrative, God had planned a series of migration flows over the past century, that is, the colonial era migration of Koreans to China, and then their migration to the US decades afterward. He did so because he entrusted Korean Chinese with a holy mission to evangelize a huge continent of infidels, as known as China. In this narrative and geographic imaginary, the conversion of ethnic Koreans in former communist countries such as China, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan obtains special missiological significance. Their linguistic and cultural capacities would enable these diasporic Koreans to deliver the gospel to their neighbors who remain largely unreached or worse, Muslims. Some of these asylum seekers may have claimed asylum on religious grounds unfoundedly at first, yet they shall return to China or venture out to other parts of the world as faithful Christians with a transformative vision. In this epic narrative, Korean Chinese unauthorized migration to the United States and their moral career as asylees come converts are elevated as part of the divinely ordained pilgrimage. What is of paramount importance here is God's motive, not asylum seekers. Okay, so let me just conclude by discussing briefly the broader implications of my approach to asylum seeking, especially how it enables us to move beyond our preoccupation with the truths of asylum seekers. So we often take asylum seekers as a self-evident object of academic analysis and policy interventions. Instead, my approach enables us to identify the complex relational matrix comprising various state and non-state actors that contribute to the making of asylees out of unauthorized migrants. My approach also avoids pitting the instrumental motivation of asylum seekers against the normative principles inscribed in state laws or faith community too easily, as a New York Times article that I showed at the beginning of the talk did. We instead must explore how differently positioned actors informed by heterogeneous institutional logics deploy different justifications to comprehend, legitimize, or delegitimize their own and others' actions. Most importantly, my approach turns attention to how migrants see the state, how migrants conceive and experience the everyday working of immigration laws, and actively partake in the dialogical production of asylees out of unauthorized migrants. But my approach differs from the venerable line of inquiry in law and society scholarship, exploring how a normative belief in the illegitimacy of law, as opposed to a rational instrumental calculation, affects people's non-compliance with law. This approach treats legal consciousness as a set of disembodied attitudes and opinions that function as a wellspring of a coherent line of actions. Building alternatively on the practice-turning social theory of action, my project approaches migrants' legal consciousness through a multiply stranded cultural schemas and situated practices in interaction. These are discernible by analyzing temporally unfolding and deeply interactional processes from the vantage points of migrants in situ. This alternative approach enables me also to recognize the critical role played by a variety of intermediaries, like for-profit and non-profit intermediaries that mediate migrants' encounter with law. Thank you for your attention.
Next up, we have the esteemed Dr. Francis Bombale giving his presentation on the need for information on migrants in Africa.
Good afternoon. Allow me to take you to Africa and share with you the real-world experiences of the migrants that I have been speaking about since morning. My presentation is not an academic one per se. It's a paper that tries to address the challenges that migrants face, what we have been able to do in terms of, moving from theory to practice. And when we talk of migrants, who are we talking about? I know migration is a subject that is poorly understood by different schools of thought. So I'll be taking you through some of the terminology, the migration flows within Africa, and specifically looking at migration and HIV. What is it that we know? And what are the best practices within the region? But also, much as we have scored a lot in terms of HIV and other health aspects, data challenges still exist, and what are the lessons we are learning? And then I conclude with opportunities for further collaboration. So the one thing I must say is that listening to all the presentations this morning, it reminds me of the first statement that migration should not be looked at as a problem to be solved, materiality to be managed, and that we all have a responsibility toward the people on the move. We acknowledge that migrants are still a hidden population that require attention, and therefore, if we are to achieve universal health care coverage targets, migrants need not to be left behind. They are human beings like any other human being. The fact that Francis has traveled from South Africa to the United States doesn't mean he ceases to be a human being on the United States soil. So when it comes to migration data, why do we need it? The historians have been speaking. The anthropologists have been speaking. I want to speak from the public health perspective. We need the data in order to assist the migrants. We've been talking about migrants. Do you know how many they are? Where are they, and where do they live? And where do they come from? If we do not know the answers to those questions, how can we help them? We need data in order to improve humanitarian response. We need data for planning, for project implementation, but also to monitor the Sustainable Development Goals and other global commitments to which many countries globally have ratified. How are we holding our governments accountable to some of these global commitments they have made? And most importantly, we need data to forecast new trends in migration, but also to do further research. From the IOM perspective, I've been working with the IOM for the last 5 years. And as many of you might know, IOM is the UN Migration Agency, whose mandate is to ensure that migration is well managed. Migration is made safe. People who are on the move are safe, they are orderly, and they are well managed. From IOM's definition, migration is the movement of a person or group of people crossing a border or moving within the state. And this is irrespective of the length, the composition, and the causes. It also includes migration of refugees, displaced persons, economic migrants, and persons moving for other purposes, including family reunification. And coming to a migrant, it is any person who's moving or has moved across an international border or within a state away from his or her habitual place of residence. So people who move within the country are internal migrants. And those that cross the borders are international or cross-border migrants. So the word migrant can be confusing, especially in the era where we are talking of international migration. We need to acknowledge that there is internal migration that is happening, and in sub-Saharan Africa, we are more concerned with interregional as opposed to intercontinental migration. When it comes to numbers, there are few of the Africans moving to Europe, moving to the United States. We have more of Africans moving within Africa. So, in terms of migration in Africa, the major push and pull factors rotate around economic opportunities, political instability, and also increasingly we are seeing environmental hazards. I know those of you who have been following news in Africa. Most recently, we've had cyclones hitting the southern part of Africa. We've had flooding hitting most parts of East Africa and Southern Africa. So these are the new trends that are causing people to move. And none of these people cross borders beyond Africa. Again, migration statistics are increasingly acquiring a vital role in the ongoing global discussions. And we know that, therefore, it's important that we keep updated on the current statistics. But also, we need data that is closely linked to the fulfillment of the Global Compact on Migration objectives, and also for monitoring the SDG progress. Within sub-Saharan Africa, we are seeing that 70% of the informal cross-border trade is undertaken by women. So we are seeing more women migrating compared to the men, and this accounts for about 30 to 40% of the SADC trade. SADC is Southern Africa Development Community. We see opportunities available for semi-skilled labor, including in sectors such as construction, mining, and services, as the major migration drivers through the region. Therefore, appropriate and prompt responses to migration challenges, as well as the capacity of stakeholders to capitalize upon opportunities offered migration are greatly limited by the fact that timely and accurate information on migration phenomena is still scarce. And coming to the migration flows within Africa, we've witnessed several migration streams. Most of the migrants are mainly internal migrants, but we also have cross-border migrants, specifically the economic migrants, and also the high and low skilled. We have also migrants moving for environmental reasons. But what has not been highlighted in most literature is the minority groups, including victims of trafficking, smuggling, and also the unaccompanied children, including the stranded migrants, asylum-seekers, refugees, and those that have failed to attain asylum seeking. Most importantly, when you look at the major migration corridors, you realize that we have people moving from within the continent, further from the north to the southern part of Africa. Majority of the people are moving to the south because the south is more developed than the east and the central. But also we witness other, migrations out of Africa into Australia, and then also we're witnessing from the other side of China into Africa. Most of the companies in Africa are Chinese companies, so we are really seeing these trends, and then all over from West Africa through Libya to Europe. These are the current trends that we are witnessing in the region. In terms of annual growth, at least 20,000 migrants travel through the Great Lakes and Southern Africa regions to try to reach South Africa each year. And the Southern Africa region in particular continues to express mixed and irregular migration flows, particularly from Ethiopia and Somalia, consisting of refugees, asylum seekers, economic migrants, and victims of trafficking, including women and children. And within Southern Africa, again, we see a significant pace of growth in number of international migrants, especially during the period 2000 to 2017. So this is what we are currently seeing within the region. And looking at some statistics for Southern Africa in particular, this is what the international migration stock looks like. We have about 7.8 million international migrants, of which majority are men, 4 million versus 3.6 million. But as you can see, most of the countries that are hosting the international migrants are mainly DRC. We see DRC, we see Namibia and Republic of Tanzania, as well as Zambia. Going into migration and HIV, these are some of the migrants whom we have been able to reach with our services, and we are being guided by the World Health Assembly Resolution 61.17 on health of migrants that focuses on 4 thematic pillars: migrant health, policy and legal framework, provision of migrant-sensitive health services, but also, most importantly, partnership and multi-country frameworks. So this guides all interventions that we deliver for migrants. Within the migration cycle, this is very, very critical for us to appreciate the different vulnerabilities that migrants go through. According to the UN Migration Agency, there are 4 stages that we recognize. The first stage, the pre-migration phase, and then this is where the push factors come into play. But from the public health perspective, you're looking at people moving as a result of events such as war, such as human rights violations, including forced migration. And at this stage, we also consider the epidemiological profiles and how these compare to the destination. And also there are aspects of culture and geographical proximity to the destination. So people move on, get into the journey, and the one thing I must mention is that sometimes migrants leave their homes when they are healthy, but it is along the movement phase that they experience lots of challenges. And depending on the duration of the journey, that can determine the severity of the vulnerabilities that migrants go through. And then they will arrive and integrate into the new communities. And this is where those factors come into play: issues around separation, issues around discrimination and social exclusion, stigma. We also witness lots of abuse and exploitation. In the context of Southern Africa, you've heard of xenophobic attacks going on, and this is basically, fellow Africans, fighting fellow Africans. So we have also issues around language. People get into new communities, and a language barrier becomes very, very, very big issue. And then finally, some of them end up returning to their countries, or they relocate to new family, to new communities. So what is known in terms of HIV is that apparently, when you look at literature, there's no, the evidence is not conclusive on whether it's the migrant who's most affected by HIV or not. But also we know that studies done on the relationship between migration and health indicate that most of the people who decide to migrate start off their journeys being healthy. Several factors affect their vulnerability along the journey, as per the previous slide. And within the global AIDS response, migrants are often identified as a key population for HIV prevention activities. Within Africa, the challenge is basically to do with undocumented migrants. Documented migrants will have access to all basic services, except the undocumented ones who are highly marginalized. And therefore access to sexual reproductive health and HIV services becomes a little bit very restricted. But also, most importantly, I must mention that migration does not equal HIV vulnerability, and not all migrants or mobile populations are at increased risk to HIV due to their mobility. In terms of approaches, what do we do to communities that host migrants or to migrant-affected communities? This is one of the frameworks that we have applied over the last 20 years within Africa through our programming. The first thing we've learned is that migrants lack information. You get into the United States, you don't know what the laws say about your entitlements. So the first thing is to create demand for health services. And we do this through capacity building. We do a lot of health promotion trainings. We do a lot of cross-border forums and also delivery of integrated health services in the spaces where migrants live. And again, once we have created demand for the services, we engage with the governments to ensure that those services are supplied and that they are responsive to the needs of the migrants. We've seen situations where migrants are excluded even at the health facilities because they either don't have the papers or they don't speak the local language, and so they will be discriminated against by the health workers. So we still have in our approach to engage health service providers to ensure that we change their attitudes. We orient them about human rights approaches to programming. Remember, these are things that are not taught in medical schools. So this is part of the work that we are doing to ensure that services are responsive to migrants. And the most critical aspect is the policy aspect, creating an enabling environment, not only at the policy level, but also at the community level to address social barriers. Violence starts in the community where they stay. So we try to engage with local leaders, with the traditional leaders, with the faith leaders to ensure that they have the right messages to pass on to these migrants. And that has helped us to reduce on, psychosocial effects that migrants go through. So ultimately, we want to see healthy migrants in health communities. Those two boxes on the other side are the two programs we've implemented, and that has been the success. There are a few stories of change that we've been able to document, and I would suggest that you download them at that link. This is one of the stories of change in Mozambique, where migrant sex workers, you're a migrant but also a sex worker, and we are reaching out to them. And what they have been able to do is to build a school for their young girls who were beginning to join them onto the streets in sex work, and that was sexual exploitation. So we've been able to engage the sex work associations, and they were able to build this school in Tete province in northern Mozambique. And fortunately, the government has supported them, and they have fully integrated. So this is, a multi-sectoral approach, of how we can engage migrants, even in the destination countries, to be more productive. A few other lessons, we have been able to engage with the governments to include migration variables so that we can be able to capture migration data. And this is what has been going on under the programs that I manage in Africa. Again, at the global level, IOM has got the data tracking matrix. This is an information management system that collects data. And if you are interested in knowing which country, including your country, how many number of migrants are there, you can download that video and also visit the resources. And then we have also the DTM portals that give us information on target population locations, the flows, and the needs and vulnerability, as well as the conditions. And as I come to the end, there are issues to do with data challenges. Much as we have been able to achieve the above, we still have issues to do, difficulties to reach the most vulnerable. The political barriers, there are different definitions of a migrant. There are also sentiments by politicians, and also the issue of inclusive healthcare systems, also the ethical considerations. I will jump this and get to this one and then the last. How having said all I have said, there are many opportunities that exist within sub-Saharan Africa. And one critical one is the research, migration research. I don't think we are doing enough, especially to question certain aspects that have been neglected. There are many interventions that are going on, but very few impact evaluations are being done to identify best practices that can be replicated in other regions. We are currently witnessing climate change causing a lot of migration, but there's no research that has been done in that area. And how this impacts the health of the migrants, no one knows about this. The issue of strengthening migration health programs and information management systems at country level is critical if we are to plan effectively for the migrants. Most of the countries do not know the migration stock in their countries. And as IOM, we are also championing the effort of developing a migration data hub for Southern Africa, which will serve as a central repository on all migration data. In conclusion, I think within the sub-Saharan Africa, one critical thing is to build capacity of the African Union and also national statistics departments to improve migration data collection and use, including identification of new data sources where traditional ones are not sufficient. And lastly, collaboration and partnership for improved migration health services and policies is critical. Thank you so much. These are just some of the global networks that I would encourage scholars to join if you have a passion for migration. And thank you for listening to me.
Next, we have postdoctoral fellow Volha Chikina giving a presentation on the integrative policies of migrants in Europe and how that plays with occupational aspirations. So if you could welcome her up for me, that'd be awesome.
All right. Hold on. Let me do a check. Okay, that way. And the pointer. All right. First, thank you, Nicholas, for the introduction, and thank you, Neil, and everyone else involved at the II for organizing this conference. The work that I will focus on today is a part of my research agenda, a part of my larger research agenda that looks into how immigrants form their ambitions. That is, what are the factors that might make immigrants more ambitious or less ambitious? What are the factors that influence how these immigrants fit within their host countries? And in the works that I will present today, I look into how their career expectations or their career ambitions might be affected by the pro-integration policies that exist in their countries. I do not have my presentation here. Oh, great. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. That's great. Thank you. Sorry about that. Why does this work matter, right? If we look at this slide, we will see that the expected percentage of immigrants in Europe and in America by 2070 is expected to be rather large. This is a marked increase over the percentage of immigrants who are currently in these European countries. For example, in Germany, demographers estimate that about 35% of the population will have at least one parent who is an immigrant. In Spain, this percentage is 40%. And as a sociologist of education, me and my colleagues, when we examine this population, we normally think about how education and better access to education can impact positively the lives of the immigrants themselves. However, when we look at these numbers, what becomes apparent is that we also need to be thinking how the education of these immigrants will impact the economies of these countries. These are huge percentages of people who, if better integrated, if better able to participate in their economies, will influence what the economies in these countries look like. Interestingly, this increase in immigrants occurs against the backdrop of an increase in far-right politics and a more prominent anti-immigrant movement. So if we look at these photographs, the first two were taken by the media in the wake of the refugee crisis, obviously equating immigrants to rapists, saying right away, you will not make Europe home. The third one I took myself while working on research and while being in Italy, and it reads, "Against the invasion of immigrants, March for Italian work." So these reminders that immigrants don't belong are around them when they go out into the streets. Further, these reminders that they don't belong are also being politicians also try to enact policies that remind immigrants that they don't belong. So the far-right movement in Europe is built around mobilizing and galvanizing anti-immigrant sentiment. Essentially, this, in addition to being populist, the main marker of this movement in Europe is that it is anti-immigrant. Brexit was largely driven by anti-immigrant rhetoric. Marine Le Pen famously says that she wants to make France more French, etc., etc. And these parties do advocate for anti-immigrant policies and reduction of pro-immigrant policies. And this is important for my work, and especially for work on immigrants and their ambition. Why? Interestingly, we know that immigrants are actually very ambitious. In fact, immigrant children are known to be more ambitious in terms of the amount of education that they expect to achieve than their non-immigrant peers from the same socioeconomic status. To me, when I was a graduate student and I started studying migrations, that was a tremendous surprise. I was thinking, I don't know why. Why would these immigrants who perhaps know that they don't belong have higher expectations in terms of the educations that they will achieve? And there is a lot of work in sociology of education that essentially says that immigrant parents have this grit and motivation that pushes their children to achieve or to expect to achieve more education than is expected of other folks of their socioeconomic status. Essentially, if we have immigrants in this group, and if your parent was an immigrant, this is this rhetoric of, as a parent, you say, I came here to this country, I sacrificed so much, I expect you to achieve, I expect you to do better than that. And it seems like immigrant children are responding to this rhetoric. Interestingly, immigrants' ambition, that is, ambition of immigrant children, is mostly examined via examining how much education they expect to achieve. We know a lot less about the careers that immigrant children are expected to have. Logically, following from what I just outlined, these immigrants should also expect to achieve better careers, right? Because they expect to achieve better education. To me, it was always interesting that the career expectations were not studied more. Because if we look at the classic models of status attainment, we have educational expectations that are linked to eventual status attainment of anyone, immigrants and non-immigrants. And they are linked actually via the jobs that they are linked to the jobs via education, while occupational expectations are directly linked to the jobs that folks are expected to get. And linking together this literature and the literature on pro-immigrant policies that I alluded to a little bit earlier, I built my set of theoretical expectations for this particular work. So first, I expect that immigrant students will have higher occupational expectations than non-immigrant students, following the idea of immigrant optimism and grit and parents who are able to broadcast these qualities to their children. And I also expect that the positive relationship between first and second generation immigrant status and the occupational expectations of the students will be stronger in countries where there are more pro-immigrant policies. Again, this is a logical assumption because when immigrants have a chance to be in environments that help them integrate, that see them more as a part of their host countries, they should expect to achieve better careers. Now, this work that I will be presenting is different from the work that we've seen presented earlier here because it takes a generalized view of an immigrant. So we had fascinating work that looked at particular groups of immigrants in particular spaces, whereas I look at an average immigrant in a number of European countries. And that calls for a quantitative assessment. So for my data, I will use several data sources. First, my student data will be from the so-called Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA. This is a survey that is carried out in a number of countries and economies across the world, and it samples a representative sample of 15-year-olds in a number of countries as to their achievement, as to their expectations, as to their sense of belonging, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I also add the data on pro-immigration policies, and that data is called MIPEX, and I will discuss that next, and a number of other covariates. You can see the information about them on this slide. So let me talk a little bit about the pro-integration policies in Europe. Essentially, there are a number of policies, a number of measures that we can use when we want to know how pro-immigrant the policies within certain countries are. One line of this work looks at how easy it is to immigrate into this country. This is not what I'm interested in. Here, I'm interested in what policies are enacted within the host countries that help immigrants become easier integrated. And MIPEX is one of such measures. So this measure, this index assesses countries on 167 immigration-related policy indicators across various areas such as market mobility, education, political participation, health, permanent residence, access to nationality. For example, one of the indicators would be how quickly can immigrants start working legally in a country, how fast they can get a work permit, whether after living for a certain amount of time within their country, they can start voting, et cetera, et cetera. And what we see here is all these policies combined for each country. So for example, these are the countries in my sample. And we can see that Czech Republic in my sample has the lowest amount of pro-integration policies that are enacted. At 45. So out of 167, they have 45 pro-integration policies. Portugal and Sweden has the highest amount of pro-integration policies from my sample, and it is 80 policies. All right, let's look at some other indicators. As I already shared with you, I'm looking at occupational expectations. Essentially, students in all these countries were asked, by the time that you're 30, what kind of job do you expect to have? And their answers were, I expect to be an engineer, I expect to be a restaurant manager, I expect to be a kitchen worker. And then these answers were mapped onto the so-called International Socioeconomic Index scale. So this scale maps every occupation in terms of its prestige and ranks them all. So the scale itself varies from 10 to 89, where 10 are kitchen workers and hunters and gatherers, and 89 is medical doctors. and everything in between in terms of the expected prestige of the jobs that anyone can have. I also want to point your attention that in my sample, I have about 5% of first-generation immigrants, 7.5% of second-generation immigrants. While these numbers might not seem too large, I have about 84,000 observations, so it is enough to have a good quantitative assessment. I also control for a number of factors. I think it is important to note that I control for the anti-immigrant sentiment within each of these countries. We can talk more later about how I assess anti-immigrant sentiment within those countries, but I do think it's an important control because it allows me to zoom into specifically the effect of policies, not of the discrimination from the populations that immigrants might perceive. All right, very fast. This is a mixed models. I use mixed models. My students are nested within the schools, and schools are nested within countries, which means that in order to properly estimate the model, I have to use random effects at the school and country levels. And my results. Again, here we see all the controls that I had. We don't have time to go through those, so I'll just focus on several coefficients that are of interest to my inquiry. First, what we see here is that first and second generation immigrants tend to have higher occupational expectations than their peers by about 7 points on the on this ISA scale that I talked about. Now you might be wondering what is 7 points really? So if we look at the scale, and for example, we look at everyone who is in the construction business, a 36 on this ISA scale, on this career prestige scale, is I'm trying to remember now, is a roofer. And a 43 on this scale, so a 7-point job, is a building electrician. So if we think about what a roofer does and what education a roofer needs and what a building electrician does, it is a substantive change in terms of the jobs that they expect to have. So this is in line with my first hypothesis, right? That first and second generation immigrants will have higher career expectations than their non-native counterparts. Another thing that is of interest to me is these interaction terms. So we see that when we look at the interaction term for the first generation immigrant status and pro-immigrant policies, and second generation immigrant status and pro-immigrant policies, these two interaction terms are positive and statistically significant. What it means is that as the amount of pro-integration policies rises, so do career expectations of first and second generation immigrants. I think it's easier to think about if we look at the figures presented here. So here we see how the positive effect of the first and second generation immigrant status on occupational expectations changes after under different MIPEX conditions. So for example, here we see that when MIPEX, that is pro-integration policies, are the lowest in my sample, immigrant students have about 5-point jump on the ISA scale. That is first generation immigrants. Second generation immigrants have about 6-point jump over their non-immigrant counterparts on the occupational expectations scale. When the amount of pro-integration policies is the highest, we see that immigrants, first-generation immigrants, expect to have jobs about 9 points on the occupational scale higher, and second-generation immigrants about, I believe that's about 8 points higher than their non-native counterparts. So this positive effect changes and it grows. Interestingly, and I think it's important to note that it is that even at the lowest level of MIPEX, immigrant students still have higher occupational expectations than their non-immigrant counterparts. And while it's not the main topic of my presentation, I think that this is an indication of the fact that it's actually important for us to really think what assimilation is, because normally we think about assimilation very often as something positive, right? We want people to be assimilating. But in case of these immigrants, assimilating will mean becoming more similar to the natives, who actually don't perform as well on those metrics that lead to eventual attainment. Again, why it is important to still maintain this positive gap is because from other work we know that immigrants are less likely to realize their expectations, and this is because they meet more barriers as they go to college and as they try to enter the job market. So it is important to maintain this jump if we want immigrants to achieve parity eventually in the job market. I don't have much time to discuss this figure. What's important to point out here is that we see the effects of pro-integration policy climate on first and second generation immigrants. It's in line with what we saw on the previous graph. Importantly, we see that native students do not get a jump from an increase of pro-integration policies. We see that this is the estimate for the positive effect of pro-integration policies on native students, and it crosses the zero line. And why I show this figure is because this is, again, very much in line with my theory, right? We should not expect pro-integration policies to be affecting non-immigrants. So this is further support of the theory that I have in this work. All right, I'm moving on to conclusions. First, I hope that I have convinced you that immigrants' high ambitions extend beyond their educational expectations, that immigrants are very aspirational, not only in terms of the educations that they expect to achieve, but also in terms of their career success in their host countries. Also, it shows that pro-integration policies serve their intended purpose. So they do serve the purpose of helping immigrants become better integrated economically into their host societies. And this is important because there is a lot of work that looks into pro-integration policies and how they affect how well immigrants do in school in terms of their achievement. And the findings there are mixed. So some studies find that pro-integration policies do help immigrants' achievement. Some find null results. There is one study that found negative results. So I think that it's important to have this work that really shows at least the associations, the positive associations between pro-integration policies and their intended purposes. Again, this is very positive, right? We see that when there are pro-integration policies, immigrants tend to do better. However, we are in the current moment where these policies, where there is a large support for the reduction of these policies. And I think it's important to keep in mind as we talk about immigrants and the fact that immigrants in America and in Europe are currently under attack. We could talk a lot. There are a lot of historians here who will also find examples in the past of the same kind of nativism. So I don't want to sensationalize this moment, but at the same time, this is the moment that we are currently experiencing. And another important thing, and it's the last thing that I will point out, is that this movement that is anti-immigrant in Europe, of course, is built on the idea of the cultural other. It's built on the idea of the economic threat of an immigrant. But the demographic realities are such that European economies most likely will not be sustainable without immigration, simply because the birth rates are so low. So I think that talking about it and actually showing that these immigrants need to come in order for Europeans to get their pensions in the future is very important. And if these immigrants are coming, that we should be trying to really help them integrate and achieve and attain the levels of success that they're capable of and that they are aspiring to attain. And I will stop here, and I welcome your questions. So thank you.
Okay, those were some wonderful presentations, wonderful pieces of research. I would like to welcome the presenters to come up onto the stage for a Q&A. I know that we're rather limited on time, and I was asked to prepare a few questions for each of you, but I'll simplify them a bit so that we can get the Q&A going out to the audience. I just want to give you guys some applause for those wonderful conversations, presentations, and pieces of research. So, I wanted to start with Professor Park's piece on these Korean migrants that existed between the Qing, Chosun, and Russian empires at some time. I noted that in your research, or in this paper, that you said that these Korean migrants came into this region essentially because of, I guess I would say, climate instability, because of this, what was termed a wet century in Korea. Leading to this sort of exodus of these Koreans in the northern region into the Tizinhui region. And I was wondering if, I think when we talk about immigrants and migrants in general, that there's kind of an elephant in the room when it comes to climate change. It's obviously leading to a spur in migrations. And do you think, given what you've researched on the role of the state with these Korean migrants and the fact that they were essentially climate migrants, that there's anything that we could apply to the modern day with our current refugee crises and migrant crises that we face?
Wow, as a historian, you're asking me to comment on the present. Certainly, I emphasized in the presentation these kind of climatic shocks, which were due to something called the El Nino back in the 19th century, which were monsoons from South Asia, which went all the way up to Alaska. And in the presentation and book in specific, I actually mentioned that because most historians who have studied this period have actually emphasized state and political factors in migration, basically arguing that it was because of the terrible Japanese colonizers in 1910 who took over Korea that Koreans were driven out of their own country. And because of the oppressive taxation policies and corruption at the hands of local clerks, that Koreans again were driven out. So my purpose in drawing attention to these kind of climatic shocks was just to give a kind of more holistic picture. Of course, there were state factors, and of course, there were bad clerks involved, as in human mobility today that is affecting people. And I guess for the contemporary situation, it would be important to take this kind of holistic view, that it isn't just climate change, which of course I believe is happening, but it is also because of these state factors and ill governance at the local level, which is driving people across borders.
Thank you. And for Professor Kim, I was especially interested in this this branch of Korean evangelism and their attitude towards these migrants that are using or that are converting to come over to America. And I was wondering, with this specific branch of Korean evangelical theology, has this been a part of their theology for a long time, or is it a more recent development that is kind of trying to find an explanation for this mass movement of Koreans coming and using or converting to Christianity to come to America?
Thanks. That's a great question. I would say that although my analysis really focused on the particular discourse of like Korean evangelicalism and its distinctive ethno-religious narrative, if anybody in the room actually studies evangelicalism and how that sort of adjusts to sort of different discourses in other contexts, they probably would find something similar, maybe like in different forms. So I would want to highlight that first. And I think your question is really spot on in the sense that certainly that kind of discourse has existed even, before the migration of Korean Chinese to the United States. I am partly relying on the existing scholarship on the sort of analysis of Korean evangelicalism, both in Korea, but Korean evangelicalism is also a very transnational phenomenon. South Korea is the country that actually sends out the second largest missionaries to the world, just next to the United States, and also a lot of American missionaries actually would include the second generation and third generation immigrants. So there's really sort of something to that. And also many of my interlocutors, their first encounter with Christianity actually took place through their encounter with missionaries, like ethnic Korean missionaries, either from South Korea or United States, other North American countries, and Australia. So there's that. But the ways in which the religious organizations, in this particular case, really sort of respond to this situation is not really like, there's this set discourse and it totally informs people's reaction to the situation. People really sort of struggle to find a way to sort of respond to this situation in a appropriately Christian way, but also there are other types of interests involved, and they get to sort of invoke the kind of discourse that's already there to really sort of make sense of the phenomenon themselves. So it's not like they immediately go to there. They really struggle.
It's a gradual process.
Yeah, so there's a certain sort of like mix of that sort of institutional discourse already existing out there, but then people really respond in interactional context. So it would be the combination of that.
Thank you very much. And for Dr. Bwambale, I was curious about this gathering of information on the health of migrants and their needs. And I can only help but living in the age that we do, wondering who would handle the health information that is being gathered, and how would we be able to create a system in a way that this information would not be used against migrants. I can't help but think of all the, especially being in America, just how much we discriminate against migrants based on like given criteria. And I can only imagine, like, if we had like all this information on, so and so or these certain people from a certain region are sick, we should just not allow migration from that region or something like that. I'm scared that bad faith actors would use this information not to help the migrants, but to basically block off their movement. And so, is there an ethical way or a certain like systemic way of handling this data so that it does not fall into the hands of bad actors? Because there's a lot of good that can come from this data regarding treating public health issues, but I'm also kind of scared given the recent political situation that we find ourselves in.
Thank you so much. I think the issue of data is a very critical issue, especially when it comes to ethics. The one thing that I must mention is that collecting this data should be really in the interest of the migrant. And that this data should therefore be used to improve the migrant's health, nothing else. Currently, there are different sources, existing sources on migrant data. Data is being collected by the immigration departments at the ports of entry. Data is being collected by the health sector at the health facilities. Data is being collected by the Home Affairs. All these are different, discrete data sources.
Okay.
Countries are troubled on how to harmonize these different sources. And again, the issue of ethics comes in. All this data is available, but what is its safety? What is the security around identification of the migrants? And how does this, play out in terms of assisting the migrant? And it is an ethical issue that we need to engage governments on to ensure that whatever data we are collecting is not meant to discriminate the migrant based on the human rights approach. At the beginning of my presentation, I said we are all human beings. Even those who claim not to be migrants, ask them, they are actually migrants. Migration is real, migration is a reality. We cannot stop people from moving. And using health data as a basis of discrimination is unethical by all global standards. So again, it speaks to the issue of what commitments at the global level have our countries ratified or committed to that protect the rights of a human being, including a migrant.
Thank you. And finally, I have a question for you, Dr. Chiquina. I was curious about your research and the ramifications that would have over the long term in terms of if we do see these integrative policies seemingly working towards allowing migrants and children of migrants having higher career aspirations and hopes, and if they're achieving these aspirations and hopes, would you think that there would be a sort of positive feedback loop in terms of how a country would then view its migrants, and then in turn they would become more integrative, and it would basically feed back into each other so that a country becomes more and more inclusive? And at the same time, would you expect to see a negative feedback loop occurring with less welcoming countries? Or is the view of migrants completely unassociated or detached from the integrative policies and the aspirations of migrants?
I think, yeah, it works, right? Yeah?
I
I think it sounds...
I think it,
Okay. So that's an excellent question. There are these feedback loops, you're right. For example, more educated immigrants or migrants experience less harassment. They experience less anti-immigrant hostility. So if we think about immigrants becoming overall more educated and having better careers, yes, there should be a positive loop in terms of anti-immigrant hostility. That should decrease. The next question is how much the policy how much this anti-immigrant hostility within population really maps onto policies. And that's some things that we just don't know enough, because what happens sometimes is that, there is a very loud proportion in the population that is able to mobilize and then push for a policy change. Overall, yes, I would expect there to be a positive feedback loop if we assume that anti-immigrant sentiment or pro-immigrant sentiment are positively related to policy change. So yeah, hopefully it happens. In terms of the negative feedback loop, yes, I mean, what works one way would also work the other way, right? So if they're less educated, then there would be more anti-immigrant hostility, et cetera, et cetera.
thank you. I'd like to open up a Q&A, and if Neil is still here. Oh, okay. We'll hand out the microphone for questions.
Hi there. Thank you all for the presentations. My question was for the last presenter today. And with regards to one way of thinking about it is if migrants assimilate, they might get less ambitious.
Yes.
But the other way of thinking about it is maybe that ambition seeps into society. So if you have a parent who used to be a migrant, and because there's work that suggests that the generation that took part in anti-war protests in Vietnam, their grandchildren are more like social activists to a larger degree. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, and it maps onto how you believe immigration happens and how you believe acculturation happens. So there is a lot of work that actually shows by a sociologist by the name of Richard Alba, who shows that assimilation is actually not a one-lane street. It's not only that immigrants are becoming more like the natives, but natives are also becoming more like immigrants, because immigrants who come to their communities, they change the fabric of those communities, they change what this country looks like. So if you think about it, it is possible that there will be positive seep through from the migrants to the non-migrants. Theoretically speaking, speaking from the empirical reality, our expectations in terms of education are growing in general as a society. Folks expect to achieve more and more education all over the world, anywhere, point any country on the map. So how this desire to achieve more education that is unrelated to immigrants, that is just a worldwide phenomena, would interact with this potential seep-through, I think it would be too much speculation for me to say. But we do need to keep in mind that, and I do believe in this theory, that not only immigrants are changing themselves, becoming more like the natives, but they are also changing how the societies that they are integrating into looks like, and some of their beliefs, et cetera, et cetera.
Two questions for Professor Park. I wonder, for question number one, if you are interested in, and of course, you don't, these are sort of like long questions, you don't have to, perhaps there's no time to go at length with them, but I wonder if you're interested in comparative work, let's say how the Russian Empire behaved in the Caucasus or in the Baltics around the same time, and if it tells anything about its nature. But the second question, I'm kind of more personally interested in the second one, is about the Koreans. It's some 200,000 people who were moved. What happened to them? Are they organized? Are they voicing any need to talk about this violent displacement within Russia? That's the second question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your questions. The first question, if you read my book, you'll see that there is some comparison to Russia's policies towards the German community on the Western side, obviously, and the Poles. And there is a simultaneity in the policies, more restrictive. But compared to, because the annexation of the eastern parts, the frontier in Siberia, the Russian Far East, because it coincided in time with the rise of a kind of Russian nationalism, and because obviously Asians look very different than a German or a Pole does, or Ukrainian, there was a kind of a more kind of a forceful posture towards Asian migrants and settlers. That being said, the Russian Empire is multi-ethnic, and so there was a policy of incorporation, but the kind of the discourse was different, and certain policies were more intense than they were on the Western Front. For the deportation, so the 1937 deportation of Koreans was the first ethnic, the full deportation of entire ethnic group at the beginning of the Great Terror. And so it wasn't just the Koreans who were forcibly moved, it was the Germans and the Ukrainians, basically taking any kind of population on the border region, right, with the enemy, the Germans, right, or the Japanese, and kind of switching places, right? So removing suspicious people from these border areas. I mean, I actually was thinking recently that an analog for the US would be the internment of Japanese Americans, right, to kind of central places, the center of the US, away from the coast, right? And so you have the Koreans being moved to the middle of the nowhere for them in Central Asia. So yeah, I mean, a lot of the people who protested were repressed or killed, right, in the Russian Far East, and then they arrived in Central Asia and they had nothing because they had no time to pack anything. And so they basically survived the first winter or two by digging holes and living in the holes. They also befriended nice Kazakhs, though the Kazakhs went through their own genocide earlier. And but whoever was left, right, they helped them out. And eventually the Koreans kind of had their own, they became a model minority in the Soviet Union. I guess did well for themselves and cultivated rice. And yeah, post-collapse 1991, it's really interesting. Some of them started to claim the Russian Far East as their original home. And once kind of migration policies within the Soviet Union loosened, they were able to move back and start farms. And actually there's, more recently, there have been kind of rehabilitation campaigns and museums to commemorate the deportation and their earlier history.
Any other questions? Going once, going twice. Oh.
I may ask one more question. To the presenter who's, actually I can read people's names. To Jaeun Kim, to Dr. Kim, I wonder again, sort of like looking at it comparatively, but also maybe globally, if the religious factor plays a similar role in migration in other places, I mean, for other religions. Sort of like trying to think of it that way.
Certainly, there is research, not really about other religions, but there is research, for instance, the Iranian asylum seekers in India or Turkey. So again, because apostasy is treated as a crime in their origin country, their sort of conversion in the transit country, in this case Turkey or India, would be sort of considered as an opportunistic move by some people, and so if they sort of make it successfully to the UK, how the sort of religious organizations there are going to sort of respond to that. There are some research and perhaps more journalistic reports on that. I haven't really encountered any research on how that might work with other religions. I mean, I always get sort of questions about, so if this is not about evangelical Christianity, if it is about like Muslim asylum seekers, I mean, how is it going to work? I would think that would work very differently in the United States, because the kind of discourse around the United States as a Christian nation, or that wouldn't work in the same way. But as a perhaps possible comparable case, although this is not necessarily about asylum seeking, the Russian Jews migrating to Israel, if their like maternal line is not sort of a Jewish line, I mean, they would be considered, they would be allowed to migrate to Israel and acquire citizenship right away. But if they want to claim all the sort of civil rights allowed to the sort of a full Jewish citizens, they would actually need to some sort of conversion process organized by the Jewish rabbi and things like that, and that relationship actually resembles a lot like this sort of anxiety around like where this conversion is coming from, but also zeal for conversion to try to make them deserving returnees in Israel. There is some similarity around that. So in terms of the sort of social process, I can find some parallel cases. Thank you.
I'll ask a question for Dr. Chikina. First of all, am I saying your name right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. That's an easy question.
Okay, yeah. No, that wasn't the question. Sorry. For the scale of prestige of different professions that was used in your research, how was that determined, and was it specific to Europe?
Yes, that's a great question. It's not specific to Europe, and what they do is they look at the amount of education that you would need to get in order to attain a certain occupation, and then at the amount of standardized amount of income that this occupation will provide you. Now, of course, it's hard to have a cross-national scale that incorporates the reality, that very precisely represents the realities in every country. But this scale has been used a lot in sociological research, and it's been verified, essentially. There are some things that, there are some small inconsistencies from country to country, but overall, this is a verified scale, and it's a mixture of education. It includes a mixture of education and standardized incomes that this occupation will afford you. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
Yes, thank you. My question is for Dr. Chikina also. The question has to do with language capability. In order to succeed in a country, to get onto the high scales, I would suppose you need to have decent language capability. In your research, do you track language skills also and, kind of match it into the equations?
So that's an excellent question. I do control for a few characteristics in my research. First, I control for student achievement, and that includes their linguistic ability and their mathematical ability combined together. Another thing is if you look at the positive effects for first and for second generation immigrants, they're pretty much the same. And interestingly to me, you would expect that second generation immigrants, they do speak the language much better, right? They were born within their host country. So linguistically, they are not different, or are almost not different from the natives. And the effects are of the same size. So I think that controlling for achievement overall does kind of help with your question a little bit. I could not in my study control for language ability per se. Well, actually, I could. I could reanalyze it and just look into whether the reading ability predicts, in the host country language predicts, introduces heterogeneity. So that's a very good suggestion. Thank you.
Any other questions? Once, twice. Okay, well, we have about 20. Well, first off, thank you for everyone who attended. Thank you for all the presentations and the research. It was all very fascinating.